dass der neue Staat nicht eines Tages von den Wolken sich niedersenkt, sondern dass aus dem Volke selbst herauswachsen muss. Denn wenn ich Treue und Glaube und Zuversicht und Fanatismus und Hingabe bekommen will, dann muss ich dorthin gehen, wo diese Tugenden noch zu finden sind. Und sie sind zu finden im Volke selbst, in der breiten Masse dieses Volkes.
On July 6, 1940, Adolf Hitler marked his triumph in Europe in Berlin, where his army chief hailed him as the greatest warlord in history. Joseph Stalin, the Russian leader and Hitler's ally, sent his congratulations from Moscow. Meanwhile, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill found himself isolated in London, and American President Franklin Roosevelt remained detached in Washington. Over the next 5 years, the dynamics among these four leaders would shift dramatically in ways that seemed impossible at the time. While their nations were engaged in armed conflict, these four prominent figures of the 20th century were engaged in a psychological battle. What began as a European conflict evolved into a struggle for global supremacy. Central to this covert war were a series of psychological confrontations where they lied, plotted, charmed, flattered, and deceived each other to gain the upper hand. Interestingly, these confrontations occurred not between adversaries, but among allies, yet their actions were self-serving, volatile, and politically motivated, despite the more favorable perceptions some may have today. The outcomes of these leaders' duels shaped the strategies for some of history's most significant battles and marked a major shift in global power dynamics, transitioning from an era of European empires to one dominated by two ideologically opposed superpowers, with dire consequences for millions. In August 1939, in the picturesque Obersalzberg, Hitler contemplated the unthinkable, invading Poland. His generals urged him to act before the autumn rains set in, but Britain and France had pledged to defend Poland. The only obstacle was Hitler's fear of a potential Russian betrayal, which could lead to a two-front war, a scenario he believed had contributed to Germany's defeat in World War I 2 decades earlier. The solution lay in forming a pact with his greatest ideological foe, Joseph Stalin. As Hitler reached out to Moscow, he unwittingly initiated a mental contest with Stalin that would ultimately influence the course of the Second World War. Stalin, however, remained deeply wary of Hitler's overtures. He dedicated hours to studying Mein Kampf, which had been published 15 years earlier, highlighting significant sections, including Hitler's opinions on Bolshevik leaders like Stalin. He noted that the current rulers of Russia were ruthless criminals and the lowest of humanity. However, Stalin recognized that Hitler was eager for an agreement and was willing to send his foreign minister to Moscow. Stalin chose to engage with Hitler. On August 22, 1939, Hitler's propaganda chief Joseph Goebbels recorded in his diary that the non-aggression pact with Moscow was ideal, and Ribbentrop's visit to Moscow was a positive development that allowed them to feel more secure. Ribbentrop arrived in Moscow on August 23rd. Yet Hitler sought one final confirmation. He dispatched his personal photographer, Heinrich Hoffmann, to examine Stalin's earlobes to determine if they were ingrown and Jewish or distinct and Aryan. They were found to be distinct, passing Hitler's scrutiny. Shortly after midnight on August 24, 1939, the Nazi-Soviet pact was finalized, which included a secret agreement for Germany and Russia to divide Poland. Hitler called Ribbentrop, declaring it would be a shocking revelation. However, as Goebbels pointed out, it was not strength but rather fear of Stalin betraying him that compelled Hitler to make this significant shift in history. The Führer felt he was in a position of desperation where he had to accept whatever was offered. In the Kremlin, Stalin raised a toast, acknowledging the German people's affection for their Führer and expressing a desire to toast to his health. Yet, like Hitler, Stalin was also motivated by the fear of a potential attack from Hitler. That evening, he confided in his close associates that it was all a game of deception, believing he had outsmarted Hitler. Stalin had found a cunning partner whom he had secretly admired for a long time. Back in 1934, he had watched as Hitler eliminated his rivals during the Night of the Long Knives and remarked on Hitler's skill in doing so. In contrast, Hitler did not share this admiration. In his early years, he was focused on the ambitions outlined in Mein Kampf, seeking an alliance with Britain while expanding eastward to establish a German empire on the continent. It was only after his initial plans had clearly failed that Hitler began to view Stalin as a potential ally. Stalin was the first of the two to commit mass murder, resulting in the deaths of millions. He once likened his victims to the boyar landowners who were slaughtered by Ivan the Terrible 400 years earlier, questioning who would remember such events in a decade or two. A week before invading Poland, Hitler made a similarly chilling comment to his generals, referencing Genghis Khan, who had also caused the deaths of millions yet is remembered primarily as a great state builder. Both leaders viewed mass murder as a tool in their ideological battles, with the state, be it communist or Nazi, taking precedence over individual lives, which were seen as expendable. This mindset extended to their personal lives. Hitler had secret lovers, particularly Eva Braun, but publicly insisted that no woman could come between him and his nation, often stating that his true love was Germany. Stalin, who married twice and had children, became even more hardened after the suicide of his second wife, Nadia, in 1932. He echoed Hitler's sentiments by asserting that a true Bolshevik should be wholly devoted to the party, telling his son that he was not an individual, but rather a representation of Soviet power. By August 1939, these two ideologically opposed leaders were closely intertwined. Just 8 days after signing a pact, Hitler invaded Poland, prompting Britain to declare war, and Winston Churchill to return to the British cabinet. Stalin publicly supported Hitler, claiming that it was not Germany that attacked England and France, but rather the other way around. The subjugation of Poland further solidified the bond between these two extreme advocates of totalitarianism. SS units executed 60,000 Jews and members of the Polish elite, marking Hitler's first encounter with mass murder, which deeply impacted him by demonstrating that his followers were capable of such acts. Meanwhile, Stalin's NKVD, experienced in mass killings, conducted similar atrocities in eastern Poland, resulting in the deaths of over 20,000 Polish officers and political prisoners, whose remains would be discovered 3 years later. As their secret police ravaged Poland, the two dictators faced their fates together. Over the next 2 years, they would both become consumed by delusions that would lead to monumental mistakes and the deadliest conflict in history. Stalin entered into his agreement with Hitler, fully aware of the risks involved, knowing he was dealing with a dangerous ally. However, he believed that the pact would provide the Soviet Union with both security and opportunities. Just a week after the Nazis invaded Poland, he informed his close associates that a war was underway between two factions of capitalist nations. He thought that Hitler, perhaps unknowingly, was destabilizing the capitalist system, which could allow the Soviets to manipulate the situation by pitting one side against the other. Stalin also had ambitions to expand his communist influence, considering the potential benefits of spreading socialism to new regions as a result of Poland's defeat. For Hitler, the pact facilitated his plans for conquest, allowing him to focus on invading France. Joseph Goebbels noted Hitler's belief in a long-term partnership with Stalin, convinced of Russia's loyalty, especially since Stalin stood to gain significantly. However, Stalin was wary of Hitler's intentions, remembering the ambitions outlined in Mein Kampf, particularly Hitler's desire to acquire Russian land for the German Reich. Anticipating a possible betrayal, Stalin sought to establish buffer zones for protection against a potential Nazi attack, compelling the Baltic states, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, to accept Russian military presence. He warned a Latvian delegation about the need for preparedness, citing the consequences faced by those who were unready. Stalin also attempted to intimidate Finland into ceding territory for additional security, but when they refused, he invaded. The invasion was disastrous, resulting in thousands of Russian soldiers freezing to death, and although the Finns eventually succumbed, they inflicted heavy casualties on the Red Army. In response to the failures, Stalin sent political officers to execute Soviet commanders. But the real issue lay in his own purges that had eliminated the army's most capable leaders. Goebbels remarked that the incompetence of the Red Army was advantageous for Hitler, stating that if Stalin was executing his own generals, they wouldn't need to intervene. On May 10, 1940, with the Eastern Front secured by Stalin, Hitler launched his blitzkrieg against the West, swiftly conquering France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, and forcing the British to retreat from the continent. For Hitler, it was a victory. For Stalin, it was a catastrophe. Nikita Khrushchev, who later became Russia's prime minister, recalled how Stalin reacted to Hitler's rapid successes. He remembered being with Stalin, who was extremely agitated, pacing around and swearing like a taxi driver. He cursed the French and the English, questioning how they could let Hitler defeat and overpower them. Stalin recognized not only the strength of the German army, but also understood that the Germans perceived the Soviet Union's vulnerability due to the recent conflict with Finland. On June 17, 1940, the French government sought peace. The prolonged and destructive war between capitalist and fascist nations, which Stalin had eagerly anticipated, ended abruptly. The following day, while Hitler celebrated in Munich with Italian dictator Mussolini, Stalin begrudgingly sent his congratulations on the Wehrmacht's impressive victory. For Hitler, this triumph was a release. He had avenged Germany's defeat in World War I. For the first time in his political career, he desired a break from conquest and sought peace with Britain. Count Galeazzo Ciano, the Italian foreign minister, was also in Munich and noted Hitler's mindset. Hitler expressed reservations about dismantling the British Empire, which he still viewed as a crucial element of global stability. He resembled a gambler who, after a significant win, wanted to leave the table without risking more. However, Stalin was concerned that having achieved victory in the West, Hitler might pursue his long-standing ambition to expand eastward. In response, Stalin initiated a risky dual strategy, seizing territory to bolster and safeguard his empire while trying not to provoke Hitler. He occupied the Baltic states and Bessarabia, a northern region of Romania, actions permitted by the Nazi-Soviet pact. Yet he also decided to invade Bukovina, another Romanian province not covered by the agreement. General Franz Halder, Hitler's chief of staff, recorded Hitler's concern about this in his diary on June 25, 1940, noting that the issue of Bukovina exceeded their agreements with the Soviets. At this critical moment, Stalin's rivalry with Hitler took an unexpected turn when he received his first letter from Winston Churchill, who had just become British Prime Minister, on the day Hitler began his blitzkrieg. Churchill urged Stalin to be cautious of Hitler and to align with Britain. Stalin did not respond and, to demonstrate his loyalty to Hitler, informed Berlin about Churchill's overture. This led Hitler to interpret both Stalin's actions in Romania and Churchill's approach in his own way. Before the war, Hitler shared with his adjutant how his mind operated like a calculating machine. He explained that whenever someone presented information to him, it was like adding a small wheel of data into this machine, creating a specific image or number. By pressing a button, he could see the total sum of all that information. This mental process led Hitler to develop a conspiracy theory with dire implications. On July 6, 1940, after achieving victory in Europe, he returned to Berlin to a hero's welcome, with the city filled with joy and celebration. General Keitel praised him as the greatest warlord in history. However, amidst this triumph, Hitler was troubled by a singular thought. He believed he had won the war, so why were the British not acknowledging this and seeking peace? He began to convince himself that there must be some external factor influencing Britain and Churchill just a week after his grand celebration in Berlin. On July 13, 1940, General Halder noted a significant shift in Hitler's thinking. He was perplexed by Britain's refusal to negotiate peace and concluded that Britain was relying on Russia. On July 19, 1940, during a speech to the Reichstag, Hitler made one last appeal for peace to Britain, but Churchill and the British were uninterested. Later that day, he received more information from the United States. Franklin Roosevelt had been nominated by the Democratic Party for a third presidential term, and his acceptance speech criticized Nazi aggression. This led Hitler to perceive threats from around the world. By July 22, 1940, he identified two reasons for Britain's continued war efforts: their hope for a change in America and their reliance on Russia, with Stalin trying to maintain Britain's involvement in the war. Retreating to the mountains of Obersalzberg, Hitler's delusions grew. The previous summer, he had been contemplating his pact with Stalin, but now he viewed him with suspicion. At the end of July, he revealed to his generals the conclusions he had drawn after weeks of deep thought. On July 31st, 1940, he declared that Russia was the key factor in Britain's strategy. He believed something must have changed in London, as the British, who had seemed defeated, were now revitalized. He concluded that if Russia were defeated, Britain's last hope would be destroyed, and the sooner that happened, the better. If we were to begin in May 1941, we would have 5 months to complete the task. At that point, it was merely a concept. However, 2 significant misconceptions were leading Hitler toward disaster: the belief that he had already won the war and the assumption that a secret agreement was forming between Britain and Russia. For Hitler, the invasion of Russia was still just a backup plan in case all other attempts to force Britain into peace failed. The autumn of 1940 brought 4 frustrating months, during which the RAF triumphed over the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain, leading to the quiet abandonment of plans for a cross-channel invasion. Despite these challenges, Hitler convinced himself that he had done enough. On October 15, 1940, he declared that the war was won and that the rest was just a matter of time. However, he still could not compel the British to negotiate, and he was conflicted about Russia, moving troops closer to its borders while also hoping for Stalin's cooperation against Britain. Major Gerhard Engel, Hitler's adjutant, recorded in his diary on November 4, 1940, that the Führer appeared visibly depressed and seemed uncertain about the next steps. Then came a pivotal moment. On November 12, 1940, Russian Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov arrived in Berlin at Hitler's invitation. Although he was greeted with full Nazi honors, the discussions that followed were tense. Hitler's intention in summoning Molotov was to propose that Russia share in the spoils of victory if it helped him defeat the British. He stated that Britain's ultimate surrender was only a matter of time, and that remnants of its empire would be scattered worldwide, suggesting it was time to consider dividing this property after their victory. However, Stalin was not interested in joining Hitler's war or in speculative divisions of the British Empire. He instructed Molotov to investigate the movements of Hitler's troops in Finland and Romania, which were close to Soviet borders. Molotov asked direct questions to which Hitler provided vague reassurances. Despite the outward politeness, Molotov's cold demeanor and probing about Eastern European territory angered Hitler and revitalized him. By November 15, 1940, the discussions had clarified the direction of Russian plans. Molotov had revealed crucial information, and the Führer felt a sense of relief. It seemed that their relationship would not just be a strategic alliance. When Molotov returned to Moscow to report on the discussions in Berlin, Stalin understood that Hitler was beginning to turn against him. In early December, he informed his generals that Hitler, intoxicated by his victories, believed the Red Army would need at least 4 years to prepare for war. Stalin thought that 4 years would give them ample time, but they needed to be ready much sooner. He aimed to postpone the conflict for another 2 years. However, Hitler was advancing at a speed that Stalin could not foresee. On December 18, 1940, Hitler issued War Directive No. 23, stating that the German Wehrmacht must be ready to swiftly defeat Soviet Russia before the war with England concluded. The invasion was scheduled for May 1941, but there was uncertainty surrounding the order. On that same day, it was clear that even Hitler was unsure of the outcome and was worried about the strength of the Russians. He hoped for a British surrender and did not anticipate American involvement in the war. Hitler had made the significant decision to engage in a war on 2 fronts, something he had initially sought to avoid by signing a pact with Stalin. He mistakenly believed that the British front was already secured and that a decisive blow against Russia would lead to British acknowledgement of their defeat. Stalin's reasoning did not align with Hitler's. He thought that Hitler needed to defeat or negotiate with Churchill before turning his attention to Russia. In early 1941, he warned members of the Politburo that they should not be under any illusions, as fascist Germany was clearly preparing to attack the Soviet Union. He questioned why Hitler would seek an agreement with England, believing it was to avoid a 2-front war. Stalin trusted that Hitler would act rationally, thinking it illogical to fight both Britain and Russia simultaneously. However, he failed to recognize a significant difference between himself and Hitler that rendered his logical approach ineffective. Stalin was a meticulous, hard-working individual who paid attention to detail, while Hitler was fundamentally an idle dreamer, drawn to the beauty of the Obersalzberg Mountains as a means to escape mundane concerns. For Hitler, the main idea was to avoid being hindered by minor details. Once he decided to invade Russia for strategic reasons, the overarching concept of combating Jews and Bolsheviks resurfaced. Throughout 1940, Hitler barely mentioned the Jews, but on January 30th, 1941, during his annual speech commemorating the Nazis' rise to power, he reiterated a menacing threat he had made before the war began. If the people were led into another world war, it would not result in the triumph of Bolshevism or Judaism, but rather the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. In a series of meetings with his generals in the spring of 1941, Hitler made his intentions brutally clear. On March 3rd, 1941, he stated that the upcoming campaign would culminate in a confrontation between two ideologies, emphasizing the need to eliminate the Jewish Bolshevik intelligentsia. By March 30th, he declared that the notion of camaraderie among soldiers must be abandoned, as this was a war of extermination. While Hitler plotted mass destruction, Stalin believed he still had at least a year to prepare. On April 13th, 1941, he sought to secure his position by signing a pact with Japan, an ally of Hitler. Delighted with this diplomatic success, he celebrated with the Japanese Foreign Minister Matsuoka. However, he was still pursuing a dual strategy. As he bid farewell to Matsuoka, the German military attaché in Moscow was present, and Stalin assured him of their continued friendship, regardless of circumstances. Yet Stalin was aware that such long-term alliances were unrealistic. Shortly after, he informed graduates of Moscow's military academy that war was imminent, with Germany as the enemy, but he believed that conflict would not arise just yet. Up to this point, Stalin's logic was sound. He anticipated a future clash with Germany and was preparing for it. However, an unexpected turn of events would lead him into a significant misjudgment. In April 1941, Stalin received a second letter from Winston Churchill, which, like the first, had a profound impact on his rivalry with Hitler. Churchill informed him that British intelligence had detected German troop movements, indicating preparations for an invasion of Russia. Stalin's immediate suspicion was directed not at Hitler, but at Churchill. He warned his military leaders that Britain was trying to manipulate both them and the Germans against each other. Then, on May 10, 1941, in one of the war's most peculiar incidents, Hitler's deputy, Rudolf Hess, flew from Germany in a Messerschmitt fighter, crossed the North Sea and parachuted into Scotland. At that time, Yuri Chudayev, Stalin's assistant who attended his important meetings, recorded and later transcribed everything Stalin said. From Chudayev's confidential, unpublished notes, we can understand how Churchill's message and Hess's flight began to lead Stalin to develop a conspiracy theory that would have devastating effects for his nation. 3 days after Hess's arrival, Chudayev documented Stalin's interpretation of these events. On one hand, Churchill sent a personal message warning about Hitler's aggressive plans, while on the other hand, the British were meeting with Hess, who was clearly a close associate of Hitler. Stalin concluded that Churchill's warning was intended to provoke a military response from the Soviets, which would give Hitler a justification to launch a preemptive strike against the Soviet Union. In Stalin's view, Churchill was deliberately trying to instigate a conflict between Germany and Russia, and he believed that Churchill's meeting with Hess was meant to encourage Germany to attack first. As he contemplated this, Stalin came to believe that Churchill was not the only instigator. On June 5th, he informed his military leaders that England, France, and America saw Germany as their best chance to eliminate Bolshevism and would therefore support the Nazis in their Eastern campaign. This belief that the democratic nations of Europe and America were conspiring against him became a deeply held conviction. Throughout May and June, intelligence reports repeatedly warned of an impending German attack, but Stalin dismissed them all as part of a larger conspiracy to provoke him. On June 12th, he told his generals that he was confident Hitler would not risk opening a second front by attacking the Soviet Union, believing Hitler was not foolish enough to do so. Meanwhile, millions of German troops were positioned near the Soviet borders, and Operation Barbarossa was set to commence in 10 days, on June 22nd. The confrontation between Hitler and Stalin was approaching its climax. As the operation loomed, Hitler felt he was fulfilling his destiny. On June 16, 1941, just 6 days before the attack, he told Goebbels, "What we have fought against all our lives, we will now destroy. Whether right or wrong, we must win. And once we have won, who will question our methods?" That same day, a Soviet spy within the Luftwaffe sent another warning of an imminent German assault, to which Stalin responded dismissively, telling the source to insult the German Air Force staff. On June 18th, Stalin's top generals, Zhukov and Timoshenko, urged him to put the military on full alert. Stalin reminded them that Hitler wouldn't attack without first negotiating with Britain, insisting that Germany would never engage Russia alone. By June 20th, just 2 days before the invasion, Hitler selected a triumphant piece of music, a section from Liszt's symphonic poem, Les Préludes. Although Stalin remained oblivious to the impending threat, his closest advisers recognized that the Nazis were preparing to invade. On June 21st, Georgy Dimitrov was in Moscow, noting the increasing rumors of an attack and the need for vigilance. He spoke with Molotov, who indicated that the situation was uncertain and that a significant conflict was brewing. On June 22nd, the same day Napoleon had invaded Russia, Hitler launched his attack at 3:30 a.m., marking the largest military mobilization in history. The Führer felt invigorated as the moment of action approached, believing that they had no choice but to strike, viewing Stalin as a threat that needed to be eliminated. At 7 a.m., I was urgently called to the Kremlin, where I learned that Germany had attacked the USSR, marking the start of the war. Stalin expressed his outrage that they had been attacked without any prior grievances or negotiations, describing the assault as brutal and akin to gang violence. His conspiracy theory about democracies conspiring against him was shattered, revealing his complete misjudgment of Hitler, whom he had mistakenly seen as a rational strategist. A year earlier, Hitler had viewed the invasion as a means to weaken Britain, but now his original ideological motivations resurfaced. He wrote to his Italian ally Mussolini, expressing relief at having made the decision to invade, stating that the partnership with the Soviet Union had been burdensome and contrary to his beliefs. While Operation Barbarossa seemed to liberate Hitler, it left Stalin in shock and despair. His anger was directed not only at Hitler, but also at his own generals, whose troop placements, decided by Stalin himself, had allowed the Germans to breach Russian defenses. He deemed this a grave betrayal. Those accountable must face severe consequences. NKVD units were dispatched to the front lines to apprehend the responsible individual. General Pavlov, the commander, was executed. 5 days later, Stalin commented that while Lenin established our state, we have ruined it. The Red Army, caught off guard due to Stalin's refusal to allow preparations, was in a rapid retreat. 2 weeks after the invasion, General Halder recorded in his diary on July 3, 1941, that it could be said without exaggeration that the Russian campaign had been won in just 2 weeks. The Barbarossa operation dramatically altered the course of the war. Additionally, Stalin's interactions with Hitler had a significant psychological impact on him. He later advised that when making decisions, one should not try to think like the other person, as it could lead to grave errors. Stalin had lost the psychological battle. Hitler had outsmarted him. However, Hitler would ultimately be the one to lose. His choice to invade Russia sealed the fate of his imperial ambitions and European imperialism as a whole. This decision would also lead to the formation of an unexpected alliance among 3 ideologically conflicting leaders against him. The relationship between the 2 prominent Democrats in this coalition began with a mental struggle that paralleled the conflict between the dictators, filled with mutual distrust, broken promises, and avoidance. This too would influence the world's future.